Hello and welcome to Man's Model Moments. In my last video on this subject, I looked at the history of scale modelling as it pertained to aircraft models, and if you've not seen that, I suggest pausing the video here and checking that one out, because I go over several reasons as to why I'm looking at scale in this segmented way. If you've not got time for that, however, and in the interests of brevity, I'll give you a potted version. Scale is too complex a subject to look at overall, so we need to look at subjects to make sense of it. I decided to look at 7 different categories: aircraft, military vehicles, civilian vehicles, ships, figures, sci-fi and space, and a generic other category for anything left over. This is the second video in the series where I'm looking at military vehicles, and then I'll be summarising everything together in the last video I do when I cover the other category. Now for each of these categories I'm going to examine the top 10 most popular scales within it, as well as show you the percentage of releases that don't fall into those categories, which will show you how much more competition exists between the scales and how dominant one or more scales are. This will hopefully become clearer when we start examining things shortly. Now, one of the most surprising things I discovered when researching this video was that military modelling just wasn't much of a thing in the post-war years. In fact, there were almost as many kits being made of these subjects during the war, with companies like Marvel and their war tanks in no particular scale at all. These were solid wooden model kits and very much aimed at children as making playable toys. As the 1940s progressed into the 1950s, models were in a variety of scales unrecognisable to military modellers today, with the most popular being the very odd 1/27th scale, or 1 inch to 2 1/4 feet, which seems just as awkward, and all produced by the US company Merco, accounting for 55% of the very few releases. The more recognisable 1/32nd scale was second at 20%, with these being manufactured by Renoir, but most importantly these blueprint models were in the high impact plastic in a format we very much recognise today, though still very much aimed at children with plenty of play features included. Third was 1/24 scale with 15% of releases. Now there are some companies making military vehicles which are very recognisable today in here though too. The first of these is Tamiya, who make a few solid wooden models, though interestingly also with no prescribed scale. This T-34 predating its earliest logo introduction in 1953, for example. The second is Revell, who just squeeze into this period with their 1/40th scale Sherman in 1955, and like Renoir, in injection moulded plastic. The next decade is when things really start to take off for military modelling. This is aligned with the rise of companies making models in other subjects, like aircraft as we saw in part 1. The most popular scale here though is no scale. Now this sounds a bit strange, but it's a very regional phenomenon, as no less than 12 Japanese companies, led by Nichimo, are making undefined scale models of armour, still including Tamiya of course, more than doubling from the prior 10% of models to 21% of releases. People wanted models and companies were making them, but many companies didn't seem to believe a prescribed scale was that important. In terms of actual scales, it's 1/76th that just forces its way into first place, though it's hardly definitive with just 13% of the overall releases, and that is almost wholly down to Airfix in the West. That's not really too surprising since this is 00 scale and extremely popular in the UK market. 1/76th scale makes its bagged kits of similar size to those of its popular aircraft kits too, and means that British rail modellers can also adopt some of the vehicles for their displays. What's a bit more surprising is that the second place in terms of releases for 1/76th scale is Midori in Japan. Perhaps they were just following the market leader here. Japan is also responsible for the next scale. Competing directly with 1/76th, it's the slightly smaller 1/87th scale, equal to HO or half O rail scale, and pioneered in military vehicles equally by Marusan and Sanwa at this time. These have almost the same share as 1/76 scale, with 12% of overall releases. The next most popular scales in military vehicles are then drawn. The first is with the birth of 1/35th scale, more or less accidentally by Tamiya with its 1/35th scale Panther. These first Tamiya kits are motorised and seem cleverly chosen to cover very popular World War II vehicles and also contemporary subjects likely to be popular in Western markets. It produces over half the 1/35th scale kits here, with the others being made by 4 other Japanese companies. Still, they only make 9% of the overall releases in this decade. Alongside 1/35th scale, an equal number of 1/48th or quarter scale tanks are being released, and this is being headed by the American manufacturer Aurora, with the only other players here being Hawk and Sanwa, both releasing a single kit each. With almost as many releases as quarter scale, the next most released military kits are in the rather bizarre 1/40th scale, making up 8% of the released military kits at the time. Revell is the main force behind these, though other familiar names are here too, such as Hasegawa. Now 1/32nd scale is still here, with quite a lot of companies making models in this scale, and more than tripling from the decade before, though shrinking to just 5% of total releases. The main player here is Frog, and with the same kits it put out previously. Like Tamiya's kits, many of these plastic kits are motorised, indicating that they were aimed primarily at children. 1/50th scale kits are next in the release tables, with quite a few, mainly Japanese companies producing this scale, led by LS in 1964 with a range of new tools, but manufacturers like Fujimi, Otaki and even Tamiya make some kits in this scale. Our last major scale in this period is then 1/24th scale, which shrinks from 15% of releases to just 3%. It seems the smaller scales here have taken people's eyes more than the larger ones. Having said that, 16% of the market is made up from a further 16 scales, and 1/27th scale is nowhere amongst them. These range from the diminutive 1/250th scale made by Shizukyo to the bizarrely large 1/15th scale made by ITC with its remote control tank, which even fired shells. As with aircraft, there is a scrabble here by model companies to choose a scale and make it popular, and there is no real clear winner at this time. I was asked in a comment in the last video about the origins of these scales, but in many cases scales were not chosen for any other reason than they were a convenient size, much like Tamiya's 1/35th scale Panther. Some were chosen for historical continuity and a logical progression, such as 1/4 scale, and others to align with other hobbies like the 1/76th and 1/87th rail scale models. Ultimately, however, it is the market that decides what it wants. As we move through the 1960s into the 1970s, this starts to become a bit more prevalent, but the military modelling market is not as dominated as the aircraft one at this time. 1/35th scale does increase in terms of the number of releases to edge out in front of 1/76 scale though, but only by a single percentage point at 21% to 20%. The company that is driving this popularity is of course Tamiya, which dominate this scale with almost 50% of the releases by expanding its range of high quality motorised kits with subjects we still recognise and are still produced today. They aren't the only manufacturer that picks up this scale however. Nichimo release about a third as many kits as Tamiya, starting from the late 1960s. Nitto and Crown are also making 1/35th scale kits in the 1960s, but it's not really until the early to mid 1970s that European manufacturers start to jump on this wave of rising popularity. It's Monogram that reacts first, reboxing some of its older unscaled toolings as 1/35th scale, and it's followed by Italeri and Hella making newly tooled subjects in Europe. Airfix are still leading in the smaller scale of 1/76, but with a much smaller majority, making 27% of these releases and with many other players in the game. Fujimi are perhaps most recognisable in second place, but Nitto release almost the same number of kits and collectively they overshadow Airfix. MPC, Ricoh and Bachmann all rebox these three companies' products in their own market, and Matchbox also enter the scene with their much loved mini diorama sets. Now before I talk about 1/48 scale, let me bring in a new contender, pushing in with a 10% market share from nothing, It's 1/72nd scale, and it's primarily being brought to the market by Hasegawa, who again make 50% of the releases here. As they are producing 1/72nd scale aircraft, they obviously made the choice to go with the same scale for military vehicles rather than compete directly with the model railway scales. Eshi are the other main name here, seeing a similar opportunity from a European perspective. That does have an impact on the other rail scale, 1/87th, which sees a stark decline of 42% in releases to just 7% overall. These are also mainly reboxes of old Marasan kits, and Aurora are one of the only companies left making new tools in this scale. Going back to 1/48 scale, the number of releases increases somewhat in terms of overall share, led by Bandai, who produced about a third of these kits in a distinctly Tamiya-esque fashion. Not too far behind them are Aurora, with both old reboxings and new tools in quarter scale. Behind them are another 6 Japanese companies making 1/48 scale armour, including Tamiya. 1/40th, 1/32nd and 1/50th scale kits all settle in around the same level of about 3% of the market, whilst 1/24 scale dips below 1% and joins the other more obscure scales, which now collectively comprise 11% of releases. Though interestingly, this again includes some models by Tamiya in 1/60th, 1/25th and even 1/21st scale, as well as some of those 1/50th. They seem to be really hedging their bets in the early days here. At this time, Tamiya also made some kits with no stated scale, as these continued to make up 10% of releases, definitely decreasing, but still as much as many of the other definitive scales. The company that is responsible for almost half of these unscaled releases is Ari, with lots of wind-up and motorised tanks, aimed very much at the younger market. Overall, if we look at the changes from the prior decade, we can see it really is a bit of a free-for-all, and whilst 1/35th and 1/76th are becoming more present, nothing at this point is overbearing. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, we start to see that shift. 1/35th scale continues to increase in number of releases, but it's met in popularity by the rise of 1/72nd scale, both swelling to more than a quarter of all releases each. In 1/35th scale, it's again Tamiya who are leading, though Italeri surpassed them when considering reissues and reboxes through other companies, as Italeri kits appear in boxes from Revell, Testors and Tomy. The next company making its own releases is then Academy, who now enter this scale space. Nichimo, Eshi and Hella are next here, and the scale is gaining momentum with other manufacturers, as we'll see as time goes on. When we look at 1/72nd scale, it's a different story, and mostly now down to a single company, but this time it's Eshi, who we saw play second fiddle to Hasegawa in the prior 10 years. Now they dominate this space with almost 75% of the releases in this scale, or about 28% of the total market. In fact, it's more than this because a lot of the other players in this field are simply reboxing Eshi kits, and it's not until we get to Hella that we find companies making original toolings in this scale. That rise in 1/72nd scale does have an impact on both 1/76th and 1/87th scale releases, both of which fall as a percentage of total. Airfix still holds most releases in the 1/76 space, but almost wholly using reboxed older kits, whereas Matchbox is investing in new tooling as well. Doyusha reboxed some old Midori toolings with friction motors for children, and it's a similar story for a lot of the other offerings here. 1/76 scale has already died, he just hasn't realised it yet. 1/87th scale, on the other hand, is a lot further down the funeral path, with only Roco mini-tanks designed to work with Loco layouts even in this game now. Once again, going back to 1/48 scale, this is an interesting one that remains static in its overall releases, but diversifies in terms of competition. Bandai, Aurora, Mitsuwa Model and Otaki all released similar numbers of kits during this time, with Tamiya a little way behind them, and a smattering of others, meaning there are a few companies actively experimenting with this scale. We then have a couple of very interesting new entries, at least one of which is an offshoot of something I was involved with at the time, military wargaming. The first of these is 1/285th or 1/300th scale, which allowed armoured action to be recreated on a table a more reasonable size than Wembley Stadium. Now, whether you consider these worthy the title of models is a question I leave to you, but that's how they're referred to themselves, how Scalemates deals with them, and I also think that the wargaming side of things is an important factor here, which is absent from many other areas of model making. The fact is that at the time, these were affordable, offered enough detail to be easily identifiable, and still needed painting etc. to be used. The one that caught me out here though was 1/700th scale, not one I'd ever associated with military vehicles at all, and yet present here in these Skywave sets by Green Max. In fact, you got an entire division, plus defences, aircraft and more in these sets. Pretty nifty. 1/32nd scale shrinks a little more, though Monogram rebox their old kits along with some new tools, Airfix invest in some new tooling, and Revell rebox the old Renwall kits, but it all feels a little like squeezing the remnants from the scale where possible. Kits with no scale shrink once more, and again it's ARRI still carrying on this habit. We also see the number of kits of other scales drop to its lowest level of just 7% of releases, whilst also absorbing the now unpopular 1/40th and 1/50th scales. So taking an overview of the progress to date, we can see that it seems to be this time where scales are being finalised. 1/35th and 1/72nd scales are ascendant, with 1/48th scale representing the compromise ground between them as the competitor scales start to fall away. Let's see if that trend continues as we move into the 1990s, where we saw aircraft modelling move into a more adult fraternity. The immediate thing to recognise here is that there is indeed a dominant scale now, and unsurprisingly, it's 1/35th. What is slightly more surprising is that it is Dragon leading the releases here, with a plethora of new tools emerging in the early 1990s and about 20% of all releases in this scale. Tamiya are not resting on their laurels, however, having a solid second place with around 10%, which tells another story we saw common in aircraft, the diversification of the market. Italeri are still going strong in this scale too, and there are plenty of other companies joining them. Eschi, Academy and Zvezda are all prominent here, and resin models start to become a thing too. Accurate Armour is a familiar example producing many kits at this time, as is Verlinden. For 1/72nd scale, about the same number of releases are being made, but that's just not keeping up with the expansion of the market, meaning their overall share decreases, but to a still very respectable 20%. Within this, it's still Eschi kits which are dominant with almost 70% of these releases, with Hasegawa in second again. What's also interesting to see is Matchbox belatedly attempt to switch from 1/76th to 1/72nd scale, making some truly excellent kits for the time that are still available today through Revell. 1/76 scale also clings on in terms of release numbers, meaning a shrinking portion of the release market, dropping to just 10% now. Airfix is still nominally leading here, with Fujimi not far behind and Matchbox in third, despite switching to 1/72nd scale at the end of this time, meaning for subjects like the Sherman they actually release kits of this vehicle in both scales within a matter of a couple of years. Rising to meet them are the Wargames darling of 6mm scale, with GHQ and Micro Armour making some absolutely phenomenal white metal reproductions for such a tiny scale. For our mid-scale of 1/48 scale though, things are not so rosy, with releases for them slowing dramatically, falling to just 4% of the total. ARRI and Academy are the main protagonists here, though Bandai are still around too. 1/87th scale also continues shrinking, now only produced by a couple of specialist manufacturers, Roco Mini-Tanks as before, and Trident Miniatures, with both of these being pre-assembled miniatures. 1/700th's brief rise shrinks back, with Pit Road being the main player now, making mixed sets that also contain vehicles. That leaves 1/32nd scale right at the bottom of the pile, about to be swallowed into obscurity by the other scales category. Here we have specialist maker Blue Jacket leading the way, with companies with more reach reboxing old tools. Speaking of those other scales, these shrink down to a collective 3% of total releases, seemingly as a last gasp towards retaining sales to younger modelers. Kits with no declared scale all but disappear now too, highlighting that market transition I first mentioned in the first of these videos from a children's hobby to a scale modeller's one. Taking a wide view over the changes to date, this is reflected in the release trends. Detailed 1/35th scale models dominate the releases, with wargaming supporting an increased set of small-scale miniatures. Other scales are neglected in favour of these, but let's see what happens as we transition into the new millennium. Now I just want to take a moment to thank all of you who have supported me directly through YouTube memberships and Patreon. This really does keep the channel going, and without you it would be very difficult for me to be able to continue doing this. Now if you're only just seeing your name on here for the first time, it's because I update this monthly, and if I've prepared some videos ahead of time, then there may still have the old list on, even if the list has been updated since then. Don't worry though, your name will get on the list and will continue to appear throughout your support. If you are considering supporting me, YouTube channel membership is by far the easiest way to do this, since Patreon is becoming a more challenging platform to engage with. Whichever you choose, however, I absolutely appreciate your contributions, and don't forget to come and check out the private members Discord, which you get access to at any level. Now the 21st century confounds us a little, as although the overall number of releases continues to grow, almost doubling in this period, and 1/35th scale is still dominant, it doesn't grow in overall share percentage of those releases, whereas 1/72nd scale bounces back stronger than ever before. What we do see is that Dragon are still in a commanding first place in terms of releases, but we also see something common to aircraft modelling. They achieved this first place with a diminished 15% of the scale, indicating again a diversification of model production. Tamiya are next, closely followed by Italeri, and then, again as with aircraft, Trumpeter muscling into the market. The surprising increase is the reversed trend from the prior decade, as 1/72nd scale gets a huge boost, for a few reasons. Part of it is a few new players coming into the market. First, it's Ace from the Ukraine, bursting into first place with about 10% of releases, followed not that far behind by another Ukrainian producer in this scale. Dragon are also making a lot of new models in this scale, and Revell joined them, supporting the Matchbox tools it inherited with a raft of new tools produced in Germany. Italeri also continues to release the now defunct Eschi company tools under its own name, and collaborates with Alzo Zero to support their wargame, jumping on the increased popularity of skirmish-type gaming made popular by Games Workshop. 1/76 scale also gets a bit of a halo effect here, and in this Airfix lead, but they do this by muddying the waters and marketing their old 1/76 scale kits as 1/72nd, which is very dishonest. Fortunately, the practice only lasts for a few years and is discontinued with Hornby ownership in the next decade. Fujimi are next in this scale, continuing to rebox their old kits, whereas Revell combine the old Matchbox vehicles with figures and some dodgy artwork, again probably to appeal to this skirmish wargame audience. 1/87th scale also has a bit of a bounce back in release share here too, though it's the same two niche players involved, but this time reversed, with Trident Miniatures producing the most here over the former leader of Roco Minitanks, and many of these releases are brand new. We then get a scale I'd not really thought of as a military one at all, and that's 1/144th scale, mainly pioneered by Dragon, though we do see Trumpeter also get into this scale by the end of the period. That now puts 1/48th scale within reach of the black hole of other scales, as we see the releases here topped equally between two different philosophies. Firstly, by old Bandai re-releases, and secondly, by a crop of new Tamiya kits. Everything else then disappears into the other scales category now, with this making up just 1% of all releases and indicating the passing of the popularity of 6mm wargaming to larger scale skirmish wargames, and the dominance of 1/35th scale with the more dedicated scale modelling circle. Taking that long view once more, we can see how with the stability of 1/35th scale, the increase of 1/72nd scale releases and start of 1/144th scale, everything else is pushed aside. Moving further into the 21st century, we see things change very little. 1/35th scale creeps up a little, and it's still Dragon that are the head of the releases here, though if we consider Trumpeter and Hobby Boss in 2nd and 3rd place together, as they are brands of the same company, they actually do push ahead of Dragon. But then if you consider the Cyber Hobby reboxes of Dragon kits, it goes back to Dragon again. Whichever way you look at it, Tamiya are next in the release tables, followed by the familiar AFV Club, and there are a lot of other familiar players making 1/35th scale military models, echoing the increasing democratization we saw in the aircraft modelling space too. 1/72nd scale also creeps up by a small amount, but these two scales are quite stable between them. The breakout here is similar to 1/35th scale at the top, with Dragon still heading out new releases, followed by Trumpeter. The main difference is that Tamiya don't release anything in this scale, but as we saw before, Italeri and Revell are both active players, and Ace still make more unusual subjects too. Once again, surprisingly for me, 1/144th scale continues to increase in number of releases, being very much driven by a number of Japanese companies. The predominant ones being Atelier Infinite, Fairy Kikaku, and Machuo Kasten. Dragon and Tacom also produced some kits here, but the most interesting ones for me were a couple from Revell, which were only ever released once. Let me know in the comments if you've ever seen those. 1/76 scale is still hanging on by its fingernails here, mainly kept in the running by Airfix and their thankfully more honest re-releases of their old HO/00 model kits, but also Fujimi reboxing and Revell's Matchbox releases. 1/48th kits remain very static in terms of release share, meaning a decent number of releases in this growing market, and that's primarily down to Tamiya with a host of new toolings in the scale, and to a lesser extent Hobby Boss continuing to support it too. 1/87th scale does diminish once more here, and though it is Roko mini-tanks and Trident once more swapping places for dominance here, they are joined by another player closing in on them for 3rd, Arsenal M from Germany. With this relative stability in the marketplace, it's also surprising to see another set of releases in another scale, this being 1/100th, mainly pushed by Zvezda with a new range of snap-together kits. We also see the expansion of the number of scales that don't make it to our 1% of the overall releases, indicating an appetite for companies to expand to address currently unmet market demands. That stability is further shown when we look at the long-term view. We do have movement here, but it's mainly in the 20% minority of releases. Let's see if the use of emergent technologies that I spoke about in my first video has an impact in the pattern for the last 10 years. Well, the first thing we can see over the last 10 years is that the dynamic has definitely changed. 1/35th releases no longer hold half of the market, but have dropped 10% to 41%, that gap being taken up by 1/72nd scale releases, which equal them for the first time since the 1960s. Still in first place here is again Dragon, with a lot of revised toolings that have additional parts added in the form of 3D printing. Behind them we have a host of companies utilising new technologies, the first of these being Tacom. Miniart also pushes into a solid 3rd place ahead of Trumpeter. Platts follow them, then Hobby Boss and Ryfield Model, which means that over 70% of the top 10 companies producing releases are coming from China. It's a similar prospect in 1/72nd scale, where about 2/3 of releases are Chinese. Top of the pile here is a newer Chinese manufacturer, SS Model, which has produced an enormous quantity of 3D printed vehicles in this scale. Beyond that, it is once again Dragon at the head of the traditional model companies, followed by another Chinese manufacturer we've not seen before here, Model Collect. Next we have an Eastern European manufacturer, IBG Models, creating a lot of new World War II tools. They're not alone either, as UM continue to produce kits both old and new too. Sandwiched between them is a really interesting company, one that has been around since the late noughties but really comes into its own during the last 10 years. It's OKB Grigorov, who makes some exceptionally unique and unusual subjects in this scale. Now whilst these two scales occupy more than 80% of the market by themselves, some other interesting things are happening in those scales with a smaller share too. 1/144th falls back to around 3% of releases, led by Fairy Kukaku, Matsuo Kasten and Pit Road in Japan, though there are 25 companies making vehicles at this scale at present. After a 30-year decline in releases, 1/700th scale comes back to us too, mainly driven again by Pit Road, though the second player is a new company, Firestarter, who seem to be making 3D printed vehicles at this scale, as are several other of the bit players here. That brings us to 1/48 scale, who maintain their niche proportion of the market releases, but the largest number of kits come from FA Miniatures, a Polish company again producing a large number of 3D printed subjects, despite only being founded 4 years ago. Second to them is Tamiya once again, who continue to add to their 1/48 scale repertoire, and then we have another 3D printed mini company, FC Model Trend from Spain. In fact, Tamiya are the only company in the top 5 here making injection moulded plastic kits. The other 4 are all resin minis, with the majority being 3D printed. Next up is a completely new scale, 28mm, nominally 1/56th, used in various wargame systems like Bolt Action. Now this only makes up about 2% of the total releases, but it's the first new scale we've seen hit the market in a significant way for 20 years. The main producers of these models are Rubicon Games and Italeri, who also rebox their kits with Warlord Games. 28mm as a scale was really championed by Games Workshop, of course, more of them when we get to space and sci-fi, but skirmish World War II games have taken off in the past decade again, spurred on by digital games like Call of Duty, Arma 3, War Thunder and World of Tanks, to name but a few. The last newcomer to recent times is the rise in popularity of large 1/16th scale armour. Now this is not an unknown scale, and there have been kits in this scale before, notably Tamiya's big radio control kits, but here it's the Chinese who have made larger kits more affordable and diverse, and these definitely appeal to both dedicated scale modelers and those more mature modelers who enjoy the lack of tiny parts. Trumpeter have led this expansion, with Tacom close behind, though there are over 20 companies now making 1/16th scale kits, something almost unthinkable 10 or 15 years ago. We also see the number of other scales expand to a level not seen for over 40 years, and that is in line with what we saw in aircraft, as more niche scales can be supported more easily with new technology. So taking a look back at the past 80 years, we can see the trends clearly as 1/35th and 1/72nd scale grew and outcompeted other similar scales like 1/32nd, 1/76th and 1/87th. But how disruptive technologies in the past 10 to 15 years have shaken up that trend and created a more diverse market, for the time being at least. Bearing that in mind, let's Pareto out the data. Remember, that's looking at the top 80% most significant portion of the data, and look at how many companies are making those 80% of releases in each scale across the decades. That shows if releases are part of a monopoly or are creating a trend that other companies are joining. Let's look at some obvious growth trends. The big two scales of 1/35th and 1/72nd have seen continuous growth in their corporate engagement since their inception, with 1/72nd scale exploding in the past 10 years. Probably because new technologies allow small companies to produce these smaller subjects without huge investment in steel tooling. 1/48 scale, on the other hand, has had a relatively small number of companies involved until the past 20 years, when more have seen the opportunity, and as we saw with the top producers, 3D printing has also been heavily utilised here, where competition is lighter and opportunity high. 1/16th scale is one that has only recently seen growth, likely due to that large investment needed to create these kits, but the 21st century has seen increasing numbers of companies see the potential market for these, dramatically increasing recently. To look at everything else here, we need to drop the y-axis scale from a maximum of 50 down to just 10. So looking at 1/32nd, 1/76th and 1/87th scale, we see similar patterns early on, with the number of companies making these scales rising in the 60s and 70s as scale was being vied for, with a dieback in the 80s and subsequent years. Interestingly though, none of these scales has actually disappeared completely, with 1/32nd looking to be the most at risk, and 187th potentially having a recent uptick, though with such small numbers it's difficult to say for certain. Now we can see that 140th and 150th scale follow a more dramatic decline, with the recent releases in 140th scale being nostalgia re-releases of old acquired tools. When looking at no scale and other scales, we see similar patterns emerge, with a decline in these followed by a recent increase. For some of the other scales, there's not too much to say other than they seem to be driven by a small number of companies, but in recent years there have been a number of them willing to cater for individuals looking for these scales, unsurprisingly showing a trend we also saw in aircraft, the broadening of the market space. We can also see that if we do the same average market share analysis that we did with aircraft, it shows a downward trend in exactly the same way that we saw with the aircraft scales. There are more players in a larger and growing market. So what have we learned today, and how does this differ from our prior look at aircraft? Well, firstly we can ascertain that these are indeed two different markets. Although 148th and 172nd scale exist as strong scales in both areas, it seems that people don't necessarily treat the two sets of subjects in the same way. Initially, and perhaps even more so than for aircraft, military models were made as toys for children, often being made from solid wood. As the aircraft market evolved, we saw large players like Airfix in the West and Marusan in Japan pushing model railway scales, but those died away at the hands of the slightly larger 172nd scale. We can also see the influence of wargaming on the military scale model side of things, something not really present for aircraft, with 172nd, 285th and more recently 156th scale. What's most prevalent, however, is the rise of the true scale model throughout this time, with the continuous and inexorable growth of 135th scale over the years, and that lead into the growth of the even more dedicated 1/16th scale. We've also seen a spanner thrown into the works in the last decade, with new technologies really shaking up the well-established trends of ever-increasing 135th dominance to one where 172nd scale subjects have had a resurgence, mostly coming from a plethora of smaller companies able to avoid tooling costs through the use of resin 3D printing and resin casting. This also has had an influence on other more niche scales, once again leading to that broadening of the market. As before, what will be really interesting is what happens next. What will that 26 to 35 data look like in 10 years' time? Will 156 scale be something of a flash in the pan as 285th scale was, or will it establish itself more fully? Will 1/16th scale continue to grow? And what about the balance between 135th, 148th and 172nd scale? I'd love to know what you think, so please do write a comment on the video down below. I do read each and every one of them. Now if you've enjoyed this video, I do hope I've earned a like and a subscription, and if you do, make sure you click the bell and set it to all so you'll know when I upload other videos. I'll be addressing the other types of models in future videos coming soon, and of course if you've not seen the prior videos in this series, then please do check those out too. That's all for this instalment of Man's Model Moments. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel for more like it, and share this video with others you think would also enjoy it. You can also follow me on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, and if you're feeling generous then I also have a Patreon, which is absolutely the best way of helping me to grow the channel and produce more content like this. With that, I hope you have plenty of modelling moments of your own, and I look forward to welcoming you in the next one.